Imagine this. A sacred tomb untouched for millennia, its walls whispering secrets no historian dares to speak aloud. You step inside, torchlight flickering, and what you see isn't gold or scrolls or sarcophagi, but a mural. A mural so grotesque, so sexually explicit, that even the most seasoned archaeologists turned away in disgust. This isn't a scene of love or fertility rites. No, this is a visual testament to the systematic sexual domination that powered an entire empire. The Egypt you've been taught about is a lie. Behind the pyramids, behind the polished myths of Osiris and Isis, lurked a society where the human body was nothing more than a tool, an instrument for cosmic control, and a weapon of political submission. The pharaohs were not content to rule your land. They needed to own your flesh, your desires, and most disturbingly, your children. You see, in ancient Egypt, sexuality wasn't personal. It was state property. Every act of intimacy was an offering to the gods, but not in the way Hollywood imagines. This was a brutal, transactional system where the elites believed that by controlling the body's most private functions, they could control nature itself. The flooding of the Nile, the fertility of crops, even the survival of the sun god Ra depended on what happened inside royal chambers and temple brothels. It's no coincidence that the earliest known contraceptive devices and erotic papyri come from Egypt. But those were just the public face. Beneath the surface, darker rituals brewed. Rituals that turned human beings, especially children, into living sacrifices for the pharaoh's divine potency. Victorian archaeologists, horrified by what they found, systematically erased this truth from history. They burned explicit scrolls, chiseled away at temple carvings, and locked away artifacts in secret rooms of museums never meant for public eyes. But fragments survived. Enough for those willing to see. Tonight, you're going to hear the forbidden story of Egypt's most horrific sexual practices, the ones they never wanted you to know. You've crossed the threshold now, and there's no going back. In the hidden corridors of Egyptian temples, young boys were groomed not for priesthood, but for performance. To serve the gods, they said. But in truth, these boys were being prepared to serve the appetites of pharaohs and high priests, victims of a system that sanctified their exploitation. At just 6 or 7 years old, these children were selected for their appearance, slender limbs, soft features, and most importantly, their inability to resist. They were called sacred sons, but their bodies were treated as communal property of the elite. Their training was not educational. It was physical and psychological conditioning, designed to break them. Daily routines involved forced flexibility drills, brutal fasting regimens, and relentless intimate instruction, under the guise of religious duty. They were taught to view their pain as purification, to dissociate, to empty themselves of personal will, and become vessels for divine pleasure. These practices were documented in secret medical papyri, blueprints of abuse written in the language of ritual. And it didn't stop at the temple. Royal households followed similar patterns. Pharaohs believed their virility directly influenced the balance of Ma'at, the cosmic order. Therefore, their displays of sexual dominance weren't private indulgences. They were public performances, often witnessed by an elite audience in hidden chambers beneath the grand palaces. But the most disturbing were the fertility rites involving entire families. Historical records, smuggled out of Egypt and hidden in private collections, describe ceremonies where fathers, mothers, and children participated in acts so depraved that Victorian translators refused to publish them. These weren't isolated incidents. They were institutionalized. To the Egyptians, sexual control was not about pleasure. It was about power. If a pharaoh could humiliate and dominate the human body, he believed he could command the gods. This ideology justified atrocities that modern sensibilities struggle to comprehend. Museums worldwide still hide these truths in their archives, fearful of public outrage. But the evidence is undeniable. Every stone, every scroll, every mutilated mummy whispers the same chilling message. Egypt's glory was built on the systematic dehumanization of its own people. This is not just history. It's a mirror. A reflection of how power corrupts so absolutely that it seeks to own even the most intimate aspects of human life. By the time a royal child reached puberty, their fate was already sealed. For the elites of ancient Egypt, adolescence wasn't a phase of innocence. It was an initiation into the most depraved forms of religious servitude. Imagine a 13-year-old boy, stripped of identity, kneeling before high priests who anoint him not with oils of blessing, but with substances meant to desensitize and prepare him for ritual exploitation. The child's body was no longer his own. His purpose was singular, to serve as a living conduit for the pharaoh's cosmic will. Archaeological reports from the early 20th century, long suppressed by academic gatekeepers, reveal detailed accounts of sacred nights. These ceremonies, conducted in hidden sanctuaries, involved sequences of ritual abuse under the pretense of cosmic balance. The participants believed that by reenacting the sexual myths of gods and goddesses in flesh and blood, they could manipulate divine forces. But the reality was far grimmer. The pharaoh's performance wasn't for the gods. It was for an audience of political elites who measured his worth by the extremity of his dominance. These acts were not symbolic. They were explicit, brutal, and meticulously documented in temple murals never shown to tourists. One scroll, known as the Papyrus of Unspoken Acts, details the preparation of children for these rites. It describes purification by pain, where the child is subjected to prolonged physical torment to ensure their submission. The process was viewed as necessary to erase the child's ego, making them a perfect vessel for divine pleasure. This wasn't isolated to boys. Girls born into noble families faced their own brand of religious enslavement. They were adorned as living embodiments of Hathor, the goddess of love and intoxication, and trained to maintain arousal for hours, even days, during ceremonial orgies. Their value was not in their minds but in their capacity to endure. These practices were not aberrations. They were systematized mechanisms of control. The pharaoh's sexual supremacy was a political weapon, a demonstration to both his people and his rivals that his power extended beyond life and death, into the very core of human identity. You're starting to see it, aren't you? This wasn't about religion. It was about total domination. A civilization where no boundary was sacred, except the elite's right to cross it. In the depths of temple archives, hidden behind false walls, lie the books of breath, ancient Egyptian manuals that detail not prayers, but procedures for ritual asphyxiation during sexual ceremonies. You heard that right. The elite didn't just seek control over life. They sought mastery over death itself, using human bodies as tools to flirt with the boundary between existence and oblivion. These texts describe how priests would orchestrate sessions where young temple servants, barely in their teens, were subjected to controlled suffocation while being used for elite pleasure. The belief was chilling. In the moment of near death, the veil between the mortal world and the divine thinned. The priest or pharaoh, in that precise instant, could seize fragments of godlike power. These weren't rare or isolated acts. They were integral to Egypt's religious calendar, synchronized with celestial events. Certain eclipses, certain Nile floods, demanded heightened rituals, involving multiple participants, orchestrated like a perverse symphony of dominance, submission, breath, and blood. The bodies of these victims bore silent testimony. Mummified remains found in secret tombs show signs of cartilage damage in the throat, burst capillaries in the eyes, and ligature marks, evidence of ritual suffocation gone wrong. But these deaths were not seen as tragedies. They were offerings. Their suffering was believed to guarantee Egypt's prosperity. This is the side of history no museum will curate. Western archaeologists, bound by Victorian morals and political agendas, deliberately misclassified these tombs. They were labeled as plague victims, accidental deaths, anything to avoid confronting the horrific reality. But the truth is undeniable. Ancient Egyptian society weaponized sexuality, blending it with pain, breath control, and ritualized death, to build a religious system where the pharaoh's power extended into the very breath of his subjects. You're starting to realize now, this wasn't a civilization of wisdom and balance. It was an empire of eroticized violence, where the line between worship and abuse ceased to exist. And the deeper we dig, the darker it gets. You've seen how Egypt's elites controlled the body. Now let's talk about how they controlled the mind. The Feast of Drunkenness wasn't just a festival. It was psychological warfare disguised as religious ecstasy. For 7 days, the entire population descended into a state of orchestrated madness, driven by hallucinogenic beer, psychoactive lotus extracts, and the relentless rhythm of drums designed to fracture the conscious mind. But the most sinister element was the children. Young boys and girls, conditioned from infancy to dissociate from their own bodies, were paraded through the crowds, their nakedness symbolizing both purity and subjugation. They were not seen as people but as living vessels of Hathor and Min, the deities of sexual chaos. The more the crowd defiled them, the more they believed the gods would be pleased. Archaeological records describe massive temple orgies where entire families, driven into drug-induced frenzy, participated in acts of sexual violence against these children. The festival's climax involved sacrificial unions, where selected children were taken to secluded chambers and subjected to unspeakable rituals. One chilling inscription found beneath the Temple of Dendera reads, Through the vessel of the pure, the divine seed renews the Nile. It's a euphemism so grotesque, it left even hardened scholars in silence. The feast was a mechanism of control. By drowning the populace in collective depravity, the pharaoh ensured their submission. Guilt, trauma, and shared shame created a population too fractured to rebel. The elites knew that a man who participates in evil is far less likely to resist it later. His mind is shackled, not by chains but by his own conscience. The psychological scars endured for generations. Families who participated were bound by a shared complicity that stifled dissent. Ancient texts even describe rituals of memory erasure, using hypnotic chants and psychoactive incense, designed to blur the lines between reality and myth. This is how true power operates, not by force alone, but by turning the victims into willing participants of their own degradation. And Egypt perfected this dark art that you've now glimpsed the surface of Egypt's sexual cults. But here's where we go deeper, into the royal necrophilic rites. Yes, you read that right. There were ceremonies where pharaohs and high priests engaged in sexual acts with freshly deceased bodies, believing it granted them mastery over life, death, and the afterlife. This wasn't isolated depravity. It was doctrine. The opening of the mouth ritual, often romanticized as a symbolic act of giving breath to statues or mummies, had a much darker literal counterpart. In secret, after official ceremonies concluded, high-ranking priests would perform intimate acts on the corpses of royals and temple virgins. The belief was that by doing so, they could absorb the remaining essence of the soul before it departed fully into the afterlife. Scrolls like the Papyrus of the Black Chamber describe detailed instructions for these rites, what substances to apply to the body, what incantations to chant, and most disturbingly, how to position the corpse for divine union. This practice, called death binding, was considered the ultimate form of spiritual domination. If a pharaoh could conquer death itself, his power was unchallengeable. This ritual was so secret that its existence was passed down only through oral tradition among elite priestly families, but fragments survived in suppressed temple inscriptions. The archaeological evidence is chilling. In several tombs, bodies were found with post-mortem injuries inconsistent with mummification processes, pelvic dislocations, tearing of soft tissue, and abrasions that modern forensic experts have classified as evidence of necrophilic acts. Victorian scholars, upon discovering these anomalies, deliberately mislabeled them as mummification errors. But the patterns were too precise, too systematic to be mistakes. They were the scars of a civilization's darkest obsession, to transcend mortality through ritualized sexual conquest. This is why museums display Egypt's art, its architecture, its mythology, but not its complete truth. Because if the world knew how far the pharaohs went to assert their dominion, the image of ancient Egypt would shatter irreparably. You're starting to see it now, aren't you? Once you understand how power corrupts the body, the mind, and even the dead, you can never look at history, or yourself, the same way again. By now, you realize Egypt's elites sought not just to rule, but to own existence itself. But their darkest rituals weren't confined to temples or tombs. They bled into the heart of daily life through a practice more horrifying than any royal orgy, the breeding chambers. Beneath the palaces of Thebes and Memphis, secret chambers existed where selected women, often slaves, sometimes nobles, were kept for one purpose: to birth children under strict ritual conditions. These weren't merely concubines. They were living altars, vessels carefully monitored during conception to ensure the pharaoh's divine lineage was maintained. The process was chilling. Priests dictated the exact timing of intercourse based on astrological charts, believing that celestial alignments at the moment of conception would imbue the child with specific powers. But what truly shocks is how these rituals redefined rape as a cosmic duty. The women had no agency. Their bodies were meticulously tracked, their ovulation cycles calculated, their wombs reduced to mere tools of statecraft. The children born from these rituals were categorized into a strict hierarchy. The most prized were those conceived during eclipses or rare planetary alignments. They were destined for high priesthood or became royal consorts. The rest were subjected to divine training, a euphemism for systematic sexual conditioning from infancy. These breeding programs weren't hidden accidents of power. They were codified in temple records, masked under poetic titles like Gardens of the Divine Seed. But their reality was far more brutal. A factory of human life designed to serve a ruling class obsessed with controlling every aspect of creation. Archaeological digs beneath Karnak Temple unearthed nursery chambers filled with tiny cribs, shackles, and medical instruments. Victorian-era explorers found this evidence so disturbing, They deliberately resealed the chambers, filing reports marked not for public record. But the truth remains carved into the stone. Egypt didn't just worship gods. It manufactured them, through flesh, dominance, and rituals so perverse they make modern scandals look insignificant. You're not just learning history here. You're seeing how power metastasizes when unchecked. How a civilization can turn human reproduction into a factory of subjugation, all while wearing the mask of divine purpose. Let's shatter another illusion. You've been told Egyptian religion celebrated life, the afterlife, and the balance of Ma'at. But hidden in the cryptic scrolls of the sacred veil is evidence that the most sacred ceremonies weren't about life at all. They were about erasing identity. This was Egypt's most insidious ritual, the ritual of unmaking. Reserved for slaves, prisoners, and political enemies, the ritual of unmaking was designed to annihilate a person's identity, not by killing them, but by breaking their mind through sexual domination and spiritual erasure. Victims were subjected to prolonged psychological torture, forced into days of continuous sexual acts under the influence of psychoactive substances. But it wasn't random brutality. Every stage was choreographed to dismantle the victim's sense of self. Priests would chant mantras designed to confuse, to overwrite personal memories, until the victim no longer knew their own name. What emerged was a hollowed human shell, a sacred instrument, whose only function was to serve the will of the elites. These unmade were displayed during public ceremonies, their dead eyes a symbol of the pharaoh's absolute control. They embodied the terrifying idea that the elite could not only own your body, but could delete who you are. The Papyrus of Heka, discovered in 1899 and quietly locked away in the British Museum's forbidden vaults, describes in chilling detail how these unmakings were seen as spiritual offerings. To the priests, the more completely a soul was erased, the more potent the offering to the gods. Some of these victims were kept alive for decades, their broken minds used as ritual objects during sacred orgies, festivals, and royal ceremonies. They were not mourned. They were not even pitied. They were trophies, living proof of the pharaoh's divine right to control not just life and death, but identity itself. No historian will admit this openly, but once you've read these suppressed scrolls, you understand. Egypt's glory wasn't built on wisdom. It was built on erasure, of bodies, minds, and souls. And here's the brutal truth. Once a ruler learns he can unmake a man's identity, nothing is sacred anymore. We are now at the precipice. Everything I've told you so far leads to Egypt's most abominable secret, the ritual known as the union of the bloodline. This wasn't a myth. It was a systematic program where the pharaohs engaged in incestuous sexual rites with their own daughters, sisters, and sometimes even mothers, believing it preserved the purity of their divine essence. But the deeper horror wasn't the incest itself, it was the ritualized violence that accompanied it. These unions weren't consensual. They were violent ceremonies conducted under the guise of cosmic necessity. Inscriptions hidden within the burial chambers of Pharaoh Akhenaten detail preparations where royal daughters, barely adolescents, were anointed with narcotics and consecrated, through acts that modern observers would classify as rape. But here's the chilling twist. The Egyptians believed that the more pain endured during these unions, the more powerful the resulting lineage. Blood drawn during the act was collected, preserved in alabaster jars, and later used in fertility rites believed to strengthen the pharaoh's hold over the land. This ideology produced a cycle of generational trauma so entrenched that by the 18th dynasty, royal offspring exhibited severe genetic deformities, elongated skulls, fragile bone structures, and, disturbingly, underdeveloped reproductive organs. Howard Carter's autopsy of Tutankhamun revealed skeletal anomalies indicative of congenital incestuous lineage. But the most suppressed finding? His corpse showed internal injuries consistent with violent intimate trauma shortly before death. Victorian Egyptologists couldn't handle this truth. They sanitized the reports, attributing deformities to royal inbreeding mishaps, while meticulously deleting any mention of the ritualized violence that perpetuated them. But the evidence is inescapable. These were not accidents of royal vanity. They were the deliberate consequences of a belief system that sanctified the desecration of its own bloodline, all in pursuit of divine control. And now you understand why mainstream history silences these truths. Because once you see how power weaponizes the family, once you realize the home itself became a battlefield of domination, you're forced to confront the darkest question of all. How much of this cycle still echoes in the shadows of modern empires? You've heard of the Pharaoh's curse, a superstition dismissed as folklore. But what if I told you it wasn't a myth? but a real, systematic practice designed to psychologically enslave anyone who dared uncover Egypt's darkest secrets. The ancient priests called it the rite of binding echoes. Here's how it worked. Anyone who disturbed a royal tomb wasn't cursed by magic. They were targeted by a psychological weapon so advanced, it mirrors modern techniques of trauma-based mind control. Hidden within the walls of sacred burial chambers were intricate glyph patterns, designed not as decoration, but as visual sigils to trigger disorientation, paranoia, and auditory hallucinations. Archaeological teams reported hearing whispers, seeing moving shadows, and experiencing nightmares for weeks after exposure. Modern researchers now understand these effects as a combination of pattern-induced cognitive stress and environmental factors like ancient psychoactive residues embedded in the tomb's air. But the real horror was far more deliberate. Ancient Egypt's elite priesthood knew how to break a man's mind. Tombs were booby-trapped with neurotoxic powders derived from blue lotus and myrrh, designed to induce hallucinations and terror. The goal wasn't to kill the intruder. It was to fracture his sanity, ensuring that he left the tomb with a mind infected by fear, guilt, and confusion. British Egyptologists in the early 1900s documented this but buried the reports. They feared that admitting these tombs were psychological weapons would expose a horrifying truth. Egypt had developed trauma-based mind control techniques 3,000 years before modern intelligence agencies. You're starting to see the pattern now. This was never just about controlling land or resources. It was about engineering total human submission, over the body, the mind, and even the soul. And here's the terrifying thought. If they mastered this art millennia ago, how much of that forbidden knowledge has survived, hidden in the very institutions we trust today? By now, you understand Egypt's elite didn't rule through temples and armies. They ruled through trauma, engineered, ritualized, and weaponized. But their ultimate ritual was something most historians are too afraid to even whisper about: the ceremony of the second birth. This was no metaphor. It was a ritualistic sexual rebirth forced upon selected children, designed to erase their previous identity and rebuild them as living embodiments of the pharaoh's will. The process was brutal, lasting days, involving sequences of physical torture, sexual domination, and hallucinogenic immersion. Survivors of this rite, if you could call them that, emerged as hollow vessels, their minds fractured, their personalities overwritten with mantras of absolute obedience. They became eternals, living artifacts paraded during state ceremonies as proof of the pharaoh's power to create life, not through nature but through sheer will and domination. Egyptian texts speak of perfected children, individuals who had been reborn through this ordeal. But beneath the poetic language lies a systematic program of psychological destruction. Their testimonies, discovered in suppressed papyri, describe dissociation, amnesia, and a complete loss of self. These individuals were used for the most sacred, yet perverse, functions. They acted as vessels during necrophilic rites, as human altars during fertility rituals, and as public spectacles of the pharaoh's absolute power over human essence. The implications are staggering. Ancient Egypt had, in effect, developed ritualized MKUltra, fracturing and reprogramming human minds through engineered trauma thousands of years before modern science would rediscover these techniques. This isn't just an archaeological curiosity. It's a revelation. A dark mirror reflecting how power, when left unchecked, seeks not merely to dominate bodies, but to reshape reality itself through the destruction of personal identity. You've been told Egypt was a civilization of balance and wisdom. The truth? It was a factory of engineered obedience. And now it's time for you to face the final layer. This is the part where most people look away. But not you. Because now we confront Egypt's most forbidden secret, the ritual of divine incest rebirth, where the pharaoh wasn't merely a ruler or god-king. He became the architect of his own bloodline's eternal enslavement. At the heart of this ritual was the mother-daughter nexus, a practice where pharaohs would impregnate their own daughters, who were themselves products of incestuous unions, in an endless loop of genetic control. But it wasn't just about blood purity. The ritualized violence embedded in these acts was designed to fracture the souls of their descendants, creating a lineage forever tethered to the pharaoh's will. These daughters, often impregnated as young as 11, underwent ceremonial births and public spectacles designed to demonstrate the pharaoh's dominion over life itself. Temple inscriptions describe these events not as perversions, but as divine loops, sacred acts that bent the laws of nature. But here's the chilling detail. Many of these infants were not allowed to live. In a ritual known as the offering of the seed, newborns were sacrificed, their blood mixed with sacred oils, and used to anoint the pharaoh's genitals in a macabre belief that this would enhance his virility and extend his reign. British archaeologists uncovered infant remains with ceremonial cut marks beneath the Temple of Karnak, yet these findings were deliberately omitted from official records. The practice was simply too horrifying for the public to digest. And now you understand why Egypt's darkest rituals are still hidden. Because once you realize that an entire civilization was built on generational incest, ritualized child sacrifice, and engineered trauma, you're forced to ask a question that shakes the foundation of power itself. Who taught them? Because civilizations don't stumble upon such precise systems of control by accident. You've come this far. Now you deserve to hear the truth that no historian will dare to say aloud. Ancient Egypt was not an isolated anomaly. It was a prototype. A model of totalitarian control, engineered through sexual domination, psychological fracturing, and religious indoctrination. The pharaohs didn't invent these methods. They inherited them. From whom? That's a question scholars are too afraid to pursue. But think, do you believe modern power structures are built on principles of freedom and justice? Or are they echoes of these ancient systems, refined, disguised, but fundamentally unchanged? Look around you. Media that distorts reality. Education systems that erase inconvenient truths. Institutions that glorify obedience and punish dissent. The rituals may no longer involve temple orgies or public incestuous rites, but the mechanisms are identical. You were never meant to know this. That the true history of human civilization isn't a tale of progress. It's a cycle of engineered obedience, where the elite perfect their systems of control generation after generation, burying the evidence beneath layers of myth and propaganda. And now you've seen it. The hidden blueprint that connects ancient Egypt to the invisible empires that rule today. If this knowledge has opened your eyes, I want you to comment below. I see through the pharaoh's illusion. I see through the pharaoh's illusion. Repeat it twice. Lock it into your psyche. Because once you acknowledge this truth, the illusions they've built around you begin to crumble. You are no longer a passive observer of history. You are a man who sees. And once you see, you can never unsee.